Hello and welcome to the North Coast Journal Preview. This is a show where we take a look at what's coming to this week's edition of the North Coast Journal. I am your host, Tanya Shrum, and we are joined today by Arts and Features Editor Jennifer Fumiko Cahill and our California Local News Fellow, Annie Toe. Welcome to you both.
How you doing, Tanya?
I am doing great, and I hope you guys are as well.
You don't know to hear it in her voice, but Tanya hung on through some technical trials trying to get me on. I have angered the robots.
Well, once upon a time when I worked at the brewery, anytime I wore my Rage Against the Machine t-shirt, they knew everybody was going home with Miss Phils. So I feel your pain.
You can't tell them you're going to rage against them. You just do it.
You just got to go for it.
Yeah,
you can't alert
so
them. Well, we have a really amazing cover story brought to us by our news fellow. Annie, do you want to fill us in on this week's cover story?
So we've talked before about nutrition in schools, but this time we're taking it outside of schools to the Humboldt County Juvenile Hall that's located across the street from the Arcade Star's Hamburger. It's a 30-bed juvenile hall facility, but usually there's a daily average of about 10 youths, which ages from 12 to 25, but most are between the ages of 12 to 17-year-olds. So most of these people are from middle school to high school ages. And these kids come from different types of backgrounds, and for various reasons, they could come in here for potential crime charges, or they could be going in while waiting for court hearings, or maybe they are just taken out from their homes for safety and given a out-of-home placement, and the juvenile hall is a form of temporary living for them. So it really depends on what on the reasons that the youth come in. But one of the things that we focused on in the story was a chef named Beth Bailey. She has been working at the detention center for over 10 years, and she recently started at the end of last year a garden at the detention center, and it was all as a part of a fellowship program with the Chef Anne Foundation, which is a program that is meant to promote scratch cooking in schools. But Beth Bailey, she was a unique case because she is actually the first person in the fellowship to join the fellowship not as part of a school, but part of a juvenile detention center. The main reason being is that the detention center follows the same youth nutritional programs as schools, so they are trying to provide the same nutrition guidelines and meals that schools do. And she basically joined the fellowship, and as part of her capstone project, she got a $5,000 grant to start a garden. She built 4 raised beds on the blacktop at the Juvenile Detention Center, and they've been growing different things like kale, broccoli, garlic, parsley, berries, a bunch of different things. And she's been using these crops that she grows into the meals that are served to the youth at the detention center. one of the main things is that the Chef Anne Fellowship wants to promote made from scratch cooking. And so she's also been working to replace some of the processed or ready-made meals that are used in the menu that they have with made from scratch meals. So instead of canned salsa, they're making it from scratch instead. But 80% of the meals that are currently served at the Juvenile Hall are already made from scratch. And one of the things that when I was working on this story that was brought up was that a lot of the youth that do come into the juvenile detention center are from backgrounds of where they are experiencing some kind of food insecurity. Jason Beam, the facility manager at the juvenile detention center, when I spoke with him, he brought up that some of the kids that do come in, it's their first time experiencing a meal that is not processed, that's made from scratch for their first time in their lives. And having the opportunity or the accessibility to have made from scratch meals for youth who are growing and developing is important to the health. Minal Rana, a professor in child development at Cal Poly Humboldt, she said that hormones are affected by children based on the type of meal that they are served, and that it can have an effect on their health in the long term if based on what they are eating. And one of the things that Rana mentioned was how having made from scratch meals accessible in areas like schools are important because a lot of families don't have access to provide these types of meals to their families. So having it available in places like schools or at the juvenile detention center gives an opportunity for families who don't have the opportunity to feed their children these types of meals the chance. And so far, Bailey has she's been able to grow a variety of plants that she uses in her meals. She makes a salad for the meals every day that she takes from the garden to put in. She also makes her own ranch, which I thought was really interesting. And although not every meal is like completely made from everything made from the garden, she likes to take some from the garden and make and incorporate it into the meals as well. Currently, the youth, the main input that they have in the garden is taste testing and like letting them know what they like and what they want to eat or like want to try next. But they're trying to work on incorporating the kids more into it. She mentioned the idea of planting some chilies over the summer and making their own hot sauce because a lot of the youth that come in really enjoy hot sauce, like spicy food.
I think this story is really inspiring, and obviously these children being exposed to a different way of eating than just opening a can, hopefully will inspire them to cook more from scratch on their own and eat less processed foods.
Yeah, one of the things that Jason Beam did mention was that some of the kids do come back and they ask for recipes of meals that they ate at the juvenile hall. And he about the homemade ranch, he also said that a lot of them say that they can't have regular ranch anymore because the ranch there was just too good.
So true. Once you have homemade ranch, you realize that Hidden Valley is just a mockery of a sham. Making your own ranch is doing God's work.
Absolutely. I completely concur. Well, before we pivot to what Jennifer's bringing to the table today, do you have any final thoughts on this piece?
It looks like this garden is going great, and hopefully this is something that is able to continue and that they're able to provide meals for people, for the youth who are struggling with food insecurity.
I agree. And I love the idea of them getting the kids more involved while they're there. I mean, either in preparation or in the gardening aspect. I just think it's a great idea, and I really appreciate you reporting it.
Yeah, and I also want to try that hot sauce if they ever make it.
True.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hey, Tanya, if I can interrupt, I was really pleased to read this story partly because I think, we think about these detention centers as being a place of punishment, and, that conversation is to be had for sure. But it is kind of wonderful to think about at least something good coming out of a kid's contact with the system, that in this one way they are, getting some benefits, some education about nutrition, an appreciation for, the kinds of home cooked meals that might not be available due to their circumstances. And, hopefully it's that part is at least a growth experience, because Lord knows they have enough on their plates.
It reminds me of some reporting that I read years ago about introducing like animal husbandry into incarcerations and all of the benefits that had for the inmates. So
Mhm.
in this way, with the juvenile hall, you have kids that, haven't been exposed to home cooking maybe, and again, it's an exposure that it makes an advantage out of, a situation that was punitive. And I think that's absolutely divine. Well, with that, thank you again, Annie. And we're going to turn to Jennifer, who's going to fill us in on more of what's coming to the table this week.
It's all food stories this week. My motto is every story is a food story. And this week we have a new writer to the journal. This is Marianne Casas Perez, who is a Cal Poly Humboldt journalism student, who is also the editor-in-chief of El Leñador. Hey, El Leñador, what's up? And she is on this week helping us with a story about Havana. And I just want to say how fantastic it is to have writers, freelancers, folks who can speak other languages and help us contact with more communities within Humboldt's greater community. It's a tremendous help, and more on that later. So she went and talked to some staff members and co-owners over at Havana in Arcata, not about Arroz con Pollo specifically, and not about the tasty mojitos over there, but in fact about Cuba, because a lot of the folks who are working there have come from Cuba, including executive chef Livani Ortega. So Schoenbaum is one of the co-owners, and we've spoken to her before for another story about Havana when they first opened. But in fact, she was running a cafe there in Havana for about a decade, I think. And at the same time, Ortega was not working for her back then, but he was also in Old Havana working in restaurants. He'd started out at 17, like a lot of people do, starting out real young in the restaurant business and working in kitchen to kitchen and working his way up to becoming a chef. And eventually, the circumstances in Cuba forced him to look elsewhere. And that meant for a while Miami, that meant Mexico, and then eventually it meant California. And a friend of his, who is another Havana native, brought him over to cook in the kitchen at Havana in Arcata. It's an interesting way, an interesting angle to look at both the economy of Cuba and how things can be under an oppressive government, and also how choices by the US government can so greatly affect an economy and individual lives overseas. And right now, with tariffs and all this other pretty much every day, we'll get to that later too. Every new thing that's happening in terms of immigration, in terms of travel, in terms of tariffs, that all changes life in other places for other people. And this might be a good time to start thinking about what it's like to live under an oppressive regime and how to adapt to it or leave. So Ortega talked to Marianne and really shared a lot with her about what it was like, including the frustration of working in the restaurant business, which is sort of it's what they say is the canary in the coal mine, right? When you see restaurant businesses under stress, you see how the rest of the economy is going to fare. Because it was hard to get ingredients, that made it tougher to do your basic cooking. It was hard to make purchases. There were a lot of restrictions on who could buy what. There were also limitations on how much one could make, how much you could profit in a business, and eventually whether that business would be basically seized by the government. And the frustration of that, the difficulty of not only just, being able to serve your customers, but what happens if you do too well was really difficult. And on top of that, there were all kinds of tumult regarding travel visas and regarding currency. Cuba had two forms of currency, but had to adopt a single currency when the pandemic hit. So in 2021, it ended that two currency system and unified under the Cuban peso, but this threw everything into tumult. And it was supposed to stabilize things, but it really jacked up the inflation and sudden price increases and devaluation of prices too at the same time. Because if you came from, for example, the States, something that as Shona Baum described, where she would have bought a sandwich for $10 before, now it was only $3. Things that, because of the vast gap between US currency and the Cuban peso, things could only cost pennies sometimes, and making change for Americans making purchases was just totally unsustainable. And so this whole chaotic financial crisis was made worse by the fact that in 2017, Trump had already promised that he was going to restrict people-to-people travel licenses, which were a special kind of travel license to Cuba, that was heavily restricted before, where you can't just go to Cuba to lie on a beach and drink mojitos. You have to be interacting with Cuban culture, Cuban people, and having that kind of cultural exchange. However, once Trump tanked that basically killed tourism. And for a restaurant like Baum's, the California Cafe, which catered very much to tourist tastes and to locals, that really tanked their business. And it's really strange to think about how your personal dream, right? The thing that you want to do, the thing that you're meant to be doing, running a restaurant, cooking in a kitchen, making the foods that you grew up with, etc., can be just so derailed by a government's decision, a foreign government's decision, world financial tumult, all those things. We're seeing it now in real time as we're watching things go wildly topsy-turvy with our own economy and with our relationships with other economies abroad. So it is a particularly interesting story that she brought us this week in terms of our current context, to look at how folks who had to leave Cuba in order to survive and be able to do the things they're meant to do, how they're feeling, because some of us are going to be faced with similar challenges.
I think it's a wonderful story, and I learned so much from her reporting. So I really appreciate Miss Casa's Perez's story and how much I learned about Cuba. And you're right, in the context of what we'll be facing here soon.
Yes.
And with that, I think it's a great transition in our last few minutes to the editorial brought to us by the full team of Kim, Weir, Thad, and Jennifer. Would you like to fill us in on the price of eggs?
The price of eggs. I know that is the practical concern that we are both obsessed with and sick of hearing about, right? It became this sort of Democratic talking point, which seemed both important in terms of economics, but also incredibly small compared to everything else that was on fire. So this week we took a look at the first 100 days, which is, we're now in the first 100 days of the second Trump presidency, and kind of where we are. And the reason that we're talking about the eggs is partly because there is this kind of conscious, sometimes unconscious framing that economic concerns are in opposition to social concerns, that somehow the price of doing well financially as a nation is that we have to crush some people. And I mean, capitalism to a certain degree, but the idea that we are going to push aside the concerns of, human rights and things like that so that we can thrive economically, it's sort of a false choice, right? And we're seeing it playing out in real time. So as we look on the 100th day, after so many people expressed that they chose voting for Trump because of a trust that he would handle our economic issues well, we're just seeing havoc in all directions. Economists as a group, on the whole, the majority of economists are saying that consumer prices are going to spike. The S&P 500 is down almost 8%. It's dumped $4 trillion in market value. The auto industry that everybody thought, oh, he's going to make the American auto industry great again. We're seeing that it is largely dependent on imported products or parts or elements that they need in order to manufacture. And as a result, we're seeing some $6 billion in battery manufacturing projects being canceled because it's just not feasible. And we've talked before in the journal about, for example, what it costs local beer companies that are going to be dealing with aluminum tariffs. Our own paper has had to adjust in order to avoid paying for jacked up paper tariffs when it comes to paper and pulp from Canada. We are seeing lots and lots of different businesses, and it's something that I hear from restaurants and other kinds of businesses, that tariffs are changing how they can figure out their margins, because so many things, our economy is dependent and interdependent with other countries and their products. So there's also the 140 executive orders. I don't want 140 of anything, but 140 executive orders, among them one trying to nullify birthright citizenship, a constitutional amendment. As a person who comes from an immigrant family, this is absolutely chilling.
And I think that, unfortunately, we are just at the tip of the iceberg and the end of the show. I encourage everybody to read the entire editorial. I think it was crafted perfectly. And I encourage everybody to pick up this week's edition of the North Coast Journal. It's going to be on newsstands tomorrow, or, of course, you can read it online at northcoastjournal.com. Thank you to you both for more awesome reporting as usual. I am your host, Tanya Shrum. Thanks for being with us and staying supportive of our North Coast community.